outside of the United States creating a domestic capability, I have not heard about Europe talking about creating a domestic capability. I've not heard about any of the competitors in Southeast Asia trying to create that capability. It really is an interesting thing. And I think it's because the world, like if I was a politician in Cambodia or Vietnam, it's one thing to be the other person who creates shoes, or the other person who creates trinkets. But if you become the person if you become the country that creates semiconductors, that's just putting a giant target on your country, especially if you're right next door to China.
Gotcha.
Right? So it's better to just say, ooh, it's somebody else's problem.
Okay.
We're going to buy our healthcare equipment from China. We're going to keep everything peaceful, right? That's what it boils down to, is the two leading economic superpowers, the near-peer competitors. They absolutely need to control the future manufacturing.
They have a huge appetite for semiconductors. Wow, that makes a ton of sense. The concentration of semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan seems to be a problem. Is this a potential catalyst for an armed conflict between China and the United States?
I think that's the question that everybody's really asking themselves when it comes to what does a future conflict between these two near-peer competitors really look like? When you consider war as a topic itself, wars are not fought over ideals. They never really have been. They've always been fought over economics, right? When you look at the Gulf War was a war catalyzed because of oil, right? I mean, even if you go all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars were a response to boycotts from the UK that were preventing goods from getting to Napoleonic France, right? So wars, the thing that makes it worth it to spend all that money and spend all those lives is economies.
100%.
And that's what we're seeing right now, even with Ukraine and Russia. Right? It's not a war of ideals. It's not a war for the future of democracy. Those are all things that we're told. It really is a war because Russia knows its future economic livelihood is tied to Ukraine, and it cannot let that go.
Yeah, no, that's a great framing. I'm reminded of the Bastiat quote, "If goods don't cross borders, soldiers will." And as I often say on this show, I say money is the means and ends of all warfare. Money sort of interpreted broadly, because obviously it's resources, right? It could be land, oil, productive capacity, whatever it may be. But the point is, you're only going to engage in the most expensive enterprise in human history, which is military combat, if there is some prospect of economic gain. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it, right? It's not a profitable business. You wouldn't engage in it. And this also plays into where we think Bitcoin is such a radical phenomenon, because it makes those resources harder to steal. If people have recourse to put wealth in something like Bitcoin, very hard to confiscate that forcibly. So presumably that's, in the long run, there's a disincentive to armed conflict. Okay, sorry, sidebar.
Well, I think that those are all great points, right? I think it's a great point that decentralized banking, decentralized money begins to kind of tip the scales against the benefits or the incentives for militarized conflict. And you're exactly right. Military conquest is the most expensive endeavor out there. And no one's going to invest in that without the intention of having a higher return on investment. Inside the world of war theory, there's multiple types of wars in war theory, but the two that I want to mention here are there's interstate war and there's intrastate war. Interstate war is what we're seeing right now between Russia and Ukraine. It's what we saw when America invaded Afghanistan. It's what we saw in the Gulf War. It's what we saw in World War II. When two standalone states, sovereign nations, when they're in conflict with each other or one invades the other, that's called interstate conflict. It is extremely expensive. It's logistics, like moving troops, moving equipment, moving weapons from one place to another. It's expensive in lives. It's expensive in terms of the opportunity cost, because when you mobilize troops and weapons to go somewhere else, you're losing productivity in other endeavors. Right. So it's a very expensive maneuver if you're going to pursue interstate war. So what the world discovered circa 2011 with Syria is that intra-state war, or a war inside of one state between two factions of the state, that really started in Syria. And interestingly enough, guess what war was just recently announced as over this week? Syria. And guess who won? Bashar al-Assad, right? The dictator that the whole world was working against. So it's really interesting when you compare what what is announced about Syria this week, right? Syria was just welcomed back into the Arab League.
Yeah.
Like all the Arab nations that used to fight against Syria and fund the opposition to the Assad regime, all of those Arab parties are now inviting the president of Syria to come back to the fold, right? So all of those sanctions, all of the death, all of the warring promises. If you remember, Assad was the one that used chemical weapons against the rebellion, and in the famous Red Line incident that Obama never actually took action on, right? So this has been a huge, interesting piece, 12 years of history to see how dictatorship and authoritarianism can win, no matter what we say. And that sort of victory is what really fuels Putin and Xi Jinping to say, maybe America doesn't have it all figured out. Maybe they really are just making propaganda of their own that democracy is the best thing in the world, because Syria is still standing in the hands of Assad.
Yeah.
And they said that would never happen.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it seems like for all the advantages of decentralization, free market economies, you get a lot more wealth creation, productivity, as we've touched on. There does seem to be this drawback, which is you're not as strong militarily, perhaps, as a super centralized police state, I guess, for lack of a better term, that can just move more with less effort, right? Whereas we suffer a lot of democratic gridlock here in the U.S., an authoritarian China can just move on a dime, right? It's like whatever
Xi Jinping said.
Xi Jinping, thank you. Can't think of his name. Whatever he says goes, right? So everyone just kind of follows suit. Yeah, that's a tough one, right? How do we deal with that problem?
Well, my theory is that's where you're seeing the rise in discussion about central bank digital currencies, right? What are they? CBDC?
CBDCs, yeah.
You're seeing this as a workable solution, because blockchain technology, without a doubt, is superior technology. Nobody argues that. Nobody in the health sector, the educational sector, the financial sector, everybody agrees blockchain technology is a massive evolution in terms of technology. It's also a technology that plays well with AI, right? The two make each other more secure. So the world's not trying to necessarily work against blockchain. But when you have decentralized banking, currencies like Bitcoin, those currencies have two fundamental problems. The first fundamental problem is that the early adopters are oftentimes illicit users, because they're trying to use money that's not on the market. And that's why you saw so much of it being used in human trafficking, and so much of it being used in drugs. And even now you're seeing digital currencies being used in fentanyl trafficking, right? And whether a big part of that is a narrative around those currencies, but there are actual use cases that demonstrate that there is accuracy to that narrative. The second big thing that goes against them is that there's no way, like you were saying, to create domestic productivity around a currency that's not being tracked or managed by the state. So if they can't draw taxes out of it, if they can't draw profit out of it, then the state doesn't really want to support it, and policymakers don't want to support it, and the people who decide what can and can't be adopted at scale are the policymakers of the nation states themselves. So their way around that has been the development of
CBDC,
right?
Yeah.
And I think the headline example is China, who last year outlawed and made all digital currencies, all cryptocurrencies illegal, while they developed their own internal CBDCs.
Of course.
And now they're making them mandatory, right?
Yeah.
Now people are getting paid. Sovereign state workers are being paid now in digital currency issued by the state of China.
Yeah. And it's also instrumental or even indispensable to social engineering programs like the Chinese social credit score system. You have to be able to selectively control people's money, turn it off, etc., to socially engineer them into the outcomes that the state desires. Yeah, forcing behaviors. Well, the Bitcoin thing, and its illicit use cases, I think the whole argument is just completely bunk, because a tool is amoral, right? Meaning it doesn't have a morality, right? You can use a hammer to do something productive, like build a house, or you can use a hammer to do something destructive, like bash a skull. To try and assign moral culpability to Bitcoin, it's like, oh, well, sex traffickers or drug dealers use it. Well, they also use a lot of U.S. dollars.
Yep, they use cash. Exactly.
The vast majority of every criminal transaction that's ever been conducted in the past 100 years has been conducted in U.S. dollars. Yeah, you don't see anyone demonizing the U.S. dollar about that, right? It's to try and blame the tool, I think, is just a failure of rationality. And to the other point that you can't easily tax Bitcoin. You can't obviously manage it or govern it or regulate it at all. That is a feature, not a bug, as far as I'm concerned. Now, the state doesn't like it,
correct,
because the state can't unilaterally extract wealth through it. However, we have to consider that everything the state is extracting is theft, right? So you're extracting these resources from productive market actors. To the extent that you stop extracting from them, you stop stealing from them, you're actually increasing the incentives for market actors to be productive. So I think it's a major net benefit for humanity in terms of innovation, productivity, et cetera. And the last caveat I would say is just on blockchain technology. This is something you'll hear in the Bitcoin community. It's a farce. Bitcoin is the only blockchain technology. Everything else is either a gambling device or a scam, basically. Now, maybe we're overly generalizing, but I think if you study the past 14 years of market history in and around Bitcoin and crypto, the thesis has largely been proven. So it's interesting, though, because you have this tool in Bitcoin that's the ultimate enemy of the state, yet it's the ultimate enemy of the state precisely because it's the ultimate benefit to the individual.
Right. It goes back to our conversation about equality, right? Guess what the state does not want?
Right.
The state does not want
fairness.
The individual
yes,
to be at the same level of power as the state.
Yes.
Right? They want sovereignty over
yes,
right, the people. They want you to be distracted. They want you to be working. They want you to be engaged in domestic matters while they're engaged in larger matters. And they do. They want to extract your wealth as the price, right, as the currency of their efficiency. There's an awesome triangle. Again, I'm a big fan of triangles. There's this awesome social triangle that talks about the evolution of society. And if you've heard this before, just tell me to shut up. On the bottom of this triangle is tribalism. On the bottom of this triangle is individualism, right? When you and I were cavemen, you eat what you hunt. I eat what I hunt.
Right.
If you don't hunt, you go hungry. If I don't shut the cave with a giant rock, a bear eats me, right? That's how it worked. You do you, I do me, game over. We evolved and organized ourselves into the next tier up the triangle, which was tribes, right? Tribalism. Now it's like, hey, I'm pretty good at climbing trees and grabbing coconuts. You're really good at hunting deer. Let's work together, become a tribe, and I'll grab your coconuts and you hunt my deer and we'll trade. But the guy across the street, like the people that live across the lake, fuck them. We'll go kill them, and then we'll take their women, hunt their deer, and eat their coconut. Yeah, right. It was tribe against tribe. Yeah. Well, the next tier above tribalism is called the state. Yeah. When you move from individualism to tribalism, you gain some efficiency. I don't have to learn to hunt deer. You don't have to learn to climb trees, but we lose some freedom. Because now I'm depending on you. I have to ask you for meat. You have to ask me for vegetables and fruit, right? So we lose some freedom. Well, guess what happens when you move from tribalism to state? You lose more freedom. Because what the state has to offer you is they can centralize and create scales of efficiency around policing, protection, education for the future, right? Social welfare systems to protect you when you're old and to take care of the sick and the needy. So the state is bringing value to the community, and that's how they do it. But then inside that state triangle, there's another triangle where you have different levels of state actors, right? That go from decentralized states to authoritarian states. But this social construct means that as you go up this social ladder, you increase efficiency, but you lose individual freedom.
Interesting.
Right? So the state knows that they're the ones that came up with the theory. They understand that. So their job is to keep people satisfied. Yeah. Right? Let them eat bread. Yeah. Or let them eat cake. I think that was what the queen said.
What do they say in, I think it was ancient Rome, bread and circuses, right?
Bread and circuses. Yeah. Right? Let them deal with that, and then keep them out of the larger matters. Yeah. But you're exactly right. That cryptocurrency, Bitcoin is as the leading example, takes that away.
It's a threat. Yeah.
It makes it so that individuals now don't have to rely on the efficiencies of the state.
Is it hyperbole to say that the state is kind of like a modern slavery complex and that it's using these different mechanisms to control the lives of people and enrich itself?
I wouldn't say that's straight up hyperbole, because when you look at other democracies around the world, most notoriously, if you look at the United Arab Emirates, they're a democracy and a close ally to the United States. They are a perfect example of modern day slavery, right? They bring in foreign workers and they hold them to contracts. They take their passports and they force them to work for low wages, right? Because they have a system that has allowed that to happen. And of course, we support that system because we get oil from the UAE.
We benefit.
Yeah. Right? So you're not necessarily wrong that it's a modern construct of slavery. But I think the big difference between the slavery that we're all so familiar with when we talk about slavery and current slavery is that slaves of the past were taken.
Yes.
Were taken away from one point of freedom and then forced into a world of forced labor. Whereas for us, we're born into this system that's already forced labor. Right. And you do have the opportunity to break free.
Yes.
But that's not an equal opportunity.
Yeah, I would say that we've definitely progressed in that sense, that in the past, as I understand it, ancient slavery, like if you're born a slave in ancient Egypt building a pyramid, there's no social mobility. Like that's what you do until you die. Today, there does seem to be the possibility of social mobility through, changing jurisdictions or becoming an entrepreneur, et cetera, et cetera. Not a lot, like it's still rare, right? If you are a wage slave or domestic slave, that you can get stuck in that situation. But there's at least some opportunity or some option to escape it, whereas in the past, there seemed to be none at all. But it does seem to be a useful framing where it's not to say good guys, bad guys. It's like when you look at human history, we've been enslaving each other forever.
Yeah.
Like it's like probably the defining feature of human history is war and slavery. And so why would we think that today we've somehow thrown off the yoke of that? I mean, we're still living in it. It's just a different format or a different implementation of it, perhaps.
I feel like the conversation itself that we see splashed across headlines is another version of bread and circus, right? Let's all focus on the slavery of the past. Let's still argue about that slavery instead of have the conversation
talking about the tax bills.
Slavery. Yeah. Let's find a way to get people fighting for, remuneration or reparations. Yeah, reparations about something that happened, in the past, because that's going to satisfy them today.
Yes.
And then 10 years from now, we'll have them focused on the outrage that they have from today.
Yes.
Right. And they do that to all of us. It's a common thread, because you always there's a specific demographic that you want to distract. Yes. And that demographic is the highest income earning, most productive demographic. What is that demographic? Your 35 to 50-year-old career, educated, productive professional, right? Male or female.
Right.
And the nice thing is in those age frames from 35 to 50, guess what we're doing to ourselves? Having kids, building businesses, getting married. Those are massive distractions in your life that keep you away from caring about current events, or keep you out of politics, or keep you away from the voting polls. So when they add on top of that, news stories and headlines and social issues that just infuriate you, but you can't do anything about them.
Yeah.
It just continues to aggravate. It's a strategy that we call at CIA. It's a strategy that we use in covert influence campaigns. You are influencing a body of people to create almost like user-generated content that feeds into a cycle of distracting them further.
Yes. Wow.
Freedom! So fresh, so new. Freedom!